It's good to be here this morning. We talked about how cold it is. It was so cold back home, it was minus 12. So, cold is relative. But that's my old home. It's not my home now. Very grateful for that. Let's turn to Galatians chapter 4. And let's read verses 1 through 5 together. Titled this sermon for certain individuals, In the Fulness of Time. Galatians chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The fullness of time was come. We know Christ came into this world to save mankind of their sins. His death on the cross and his resurrection did that, accomplished that. But it was also the beginning of his kingdom that was started here on earth as well. The word fullness in verse 4 means completion. It can be defined as the full end of something. In other words, it was the time appointed by the Father, going back to verse 2. This was a time, and a glorious time, when the law of Moses was giving way to the law of Christ. When the mystery of God, partially revealed in the Old Testament, was now being revealed in the New Testament times. When forgiveness of sins forgiven only in prospect would now be completely forgiven, because that sinless, perfect sacrifice. God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, as it states. Prophecy going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. But not just any woman. As Isaiah wrote, Isaiah 7:14, a virgin. She was a virgin. Now, I think if it was up to man, he never would have come. Or at this period of time, he wouldn't have been sent. But God, of course, knew that the Jews would reject him for the most part, that Herod would try to kill him, that his disciples would be persecuted by the Jews, but then later, for over a couple of centuries, by Rome, at times horribly so. If it was up to man, man probably would have said, no, this is not the right time. But according to God, it was the right time for for Jesus to come into this world and establish his kingdom. But why this time? Did you ever wonder about that? Why this time at this period in the history of the human race? What made this time the fullness, or the perfect time? The time for his purpose, as A.T. Robertson stated, the time for his purpose was come. It was fulfilled. It was the best, it was the perfect time for a number of reasons. The law of Moses had done its part. Was there anything more that the law of Moses could do? Really, no. It had done its part, pointing out to the Jewish people about the Messiah that was coming. It prepared them for the coming of the Messiah. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, we read, "Wherefore, The law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. It was their schoolmaster, their tutor. That's another word you could use. But it wasn't just the law of Moses. When we talk about the fullness of time, the completion, if you will, there were some other things that were in place, had been put in place long before this time came about. There were, you remember, 4 kingdoms that Daniel prophesied about to King Nebuchadnezzar. 4 kingdoms that had their part to play in making this the fullness of time. And that was Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. So let's turn our attention to that first kingdom, Babylon. I'll turn back to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is a very important chapter in this wonderful, great book, in all the books of the Old Testament. Now let's refresh our minds to what had taken place. King Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon at this time, the Babylonian Empire, was the most powerful empire on the world, so he was the most powerful king. He had the rule of life or death over every person at that period of time. We think that the presidents today have power. They don't have a clue what power was. These men were so powerful they even thought of themselves as gods, like the pharaohs did in Egyptian times. But Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and it's a dream that troubled him, but he could not remember what he dreamed of. So he called his magicians, his sorcerers, wise men of that period of time, which included Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As Brother Gallagher said, they're Babylonian names. So they were also wise men. And he wanted these individuals to tell him what he dreamed, but of course they could not do it. They asked for, well, tell us what you dreamed, and then we'll give you the interpretation of it. Well, he couldn't remember the dream. Of course, he also knew that if he told them what the dream was, they'd just make something up. So he became angry with them, and he was going to have all the wise men put to death. And that brings our attention to Daniel. And God, in a vision, gave him the interpretation of what this dream that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. So he appeared before the court of Nebuchadnezzar, and he began to exclaim what this dream was, to interpret it. In Daniel chapter 2, let's drop down to verse 31. Speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, stated, Thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then verse 36 begins to interpret the dream for him. And he mentions in verse 38 that Nebuchadnezzar, his kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom, that was that head of gold on this statue. Now, there was a contribution that the Babylonian Empire, whether they realized it at that time or not, a contribution that they made for that fullness of time that would come many, many years later. And that, as we all know, was the worship in the synagogues. Around 606, was the first dispersion. You could refer to it as the carrying away from Judea, from Jerusalem, by Babylon when they began to conquer that area. Taken away to Babylon. A lot of Bible scholars believe that this was when Daniel and his 3 friends were taken away as well. The second time would be 597 BC. That was the second dispersion. And the third and the final was in 586 BC, and that was with the total destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonian forces, which also included the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Only the poorest of the poor were left behind, and they were to be the tenders of the vineyards at that period of time, or as they phrased it, the husbandmen. But being in Babylon, of course, they would not be able to worship there in Jerusalem, and of course the temple was destroyed anyway. So what they did was they had these synagogues, these places of worship where they could worship Jehovah. And the word synagogue means a number of things. It refers to the gathering. It can refer to as the congregation, because this is basically where the congregation gathered to worship Jehovah, wherever they were in Babylonian captivity. Now afterwards, they would be allowed to return to Jerusalem and Judea. And it is thought that it took at least 10 families to be able to establish a synagogue. And this is what they did in Judea, Jerusalem, and then as they were scattered throughout the world, wherever the Jewish people met to worship God, there had to be at least 10 families, and of course more than that at times. So when Jesus began to teach his gospel, his word, they taught it to the Jews, of course, at first. But later, when his apostles and all disciples were spreading the word, the gospel of Christ, they would go to these synagogues. You remember, as it was with Paul on the missionary journeys, when he came to a town, guess where he started to preach? For the most part, he started in those synagogues. And if they rejected him, as they would from time to time, he then went to the Gentiles. So the synagogues played a part for the fullness of time, for Jesus to come into this world and the kingdom to be established, his kingdom to be established. Now the second kingdom was the Persian Empire. The breast and arms of silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire that conquered Babylon. And they basically conquered the city of Babylon with a whimper. They quickly gave up. But the chief contribution of the Medes and the Persians was their law. They believed wholeheartedly in the importance of law and order, that even the king was subject to the law. Now with Nebuchadnezzar, he wasn't. He was above the law. But with the kings like the Medo-Persian Empire, you remember Darius, chapter 6, he was not above the law. So when they had that law decreed that was basically going to put Daniel to death and the lion's den, he could not overrule that. And the phrase went, Daniel 6 verse 8, the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. It didn't change. Could be changed. The respect of law and order really came to the forefront by this empire. And when Rome came to the forefront with their empire, they took this part. They took a little bit of everything from all of these kingdoms. But the importance of law and order was paramount. This nation has been described as a country of laws, as well it should be, for everyone. Now the third empire in this dream that Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar was, of course, Greece. The belly and thighs of brass represented the Grecian Empire that conquered the Persians. The chief contribution under this period, what Greece brought, was Hellenism, the Greek culture. We talked about this previously. When Alexander the Great was conquering the world, he left those who had been conquered subject to that Greek culture, but specifically the Greek language. At this period of time, it was that Koine Greek, also known as the common language. It was the language of the common man at this period of time. You could describe it as the English of our times for them. The Koine Greek. This was a language that God chose, just as he chose Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. If you want to do a good study on why God chose these languages, it's a good study. Write up a manuscript on it. It'll stay with you. I was forced to in school. But the Greek language, as we all know, that Koine Greek, what makes it special, and God knew it would take place this way, is that's a dead language. But I also like what Rex Turner Sr. said about the Koine Greek. He said it was a language that was sufficiently versatile to allow for fine spiritual distinction. And there are times at interpreting it from the Koine into English, I don't know, that's not the proper term, but sometimes the English doesn't do it worthy. It gets close. That's why it's important to have a lexicon and understand what that word meant at that period of time. And that's the beauty of the Koine Greek. It's a dead language. Brother Hatcher mentioned in Bible class that languages change. You think about the English language, it's always changing. That's one of the reasons why it is so difficult for people who did not grow up in this country to learn it, with all the slang that is out there. But words that meant one thing a number of years ago, they don't mean that today. Or a word that was not considered proper, ain't, for an example, now, well, it's in the English language. They caved in, if you want to phrase it that way. But the English language is interesting because it seems to always be changing. And you will get arguments with English teachers over this, that, or the other, because the rules change. It used to be that you were not supposed to start a sentence with the word but. But sometimes you can. But the problem with that is you can use it too much. People will focus on that word than the actual sentence is being used. But words change. With the Koine, it doesn't change. It cannot change. It's a dead language. And we know what the beauty of that is. What it meant in that first century is what it means in the 21st century, or the 22nd, or the 23rd, or for however long this world continues to be about. It will not change. And this was the language in Jesus' day, the common language. And it was all over the known world at that period of time. So when the disciples began to leave Jerusalem and go spread the gospel, they used that Koine Greek language to do that. The fourth kingdom, Daniel 2:33, that fourth and last kingdom was Rome, the Roman Empire. The legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay, represented the Roman Empire. The chief contribution from Rome, it was a number of things, actually. As I mentioned earlier, they took a lot of different things from the empires that came before them. Synagogue worship, for example, was still in existence. And Rome was pretty good about certain things. One is if they conquered a nation was already had a certain religion in place, they would allow it. So they allowed the synagogue worship to continue. The Greek language was still in power at that time, although they were trying to push Latin, but they only got so far with that in that first century when the disciples were preaching it. Greek was still the common language. Paul, being a citizen of Rome, that also gave him certain privileges that others would not have. From the Persian Empire, they took the importance of law. They believed in that as well. So they took that into effect. The Roman engineers will go down in history as being some of the greatest engineers ever to live. Some of their structures are still on the planet today. The Colosseum of Rome, for example, still there. That's a few thousand years old. They seem to be the ones who really started devising how to put concrete together. The aqueducts that they were able to build, but the roads. It is believed that they made somewhere around 250,000 miles of roads. So we understand where we get that phrase, all roads lead to Rome, because they did at that period of time. And some of those roads are still in existence. Think about the Appian Way leading out of Rome. That's still there. You can still walk on it. And other places throughout the empire, their empire at that time, those roads still exist. They were very good. Those roads were used for commerce, but they were also used to keep an eye on their kingdom, which meant sometimes those roads were used for the legionnaires to quell disturbances. But of course, Christians used those same roads to spread the gospel throughout the world, thanks to Rome. So all of these kingdoms had a part in bringing together that fullness of the time. But also notice with me Daniel chapter 2. Probably the most important verse in this chapter, maybe in all of the book. And in the days of these kings, what kings? Well, the context is Rome, starting in verse 40. In the days of these kings, or the days of these emperors, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And it did, all of those kingdoms that came about. Last one being Rome. The early church, basically they turned that empire upside down because they couldn't stop the early Christians. But a kingdom, and we know that the kingdom is also the church here on earth, will never be destroyed. We've been noticing that as long as the world exists, that there will be Christians here, maybe a small group, but the church, the kingdom, will continue to exist. I can remember having a discussion with my mother when I was probably around 13 or so with the old USSR, and there was a fear of attack and annihilation, and she just simply stated, don't have to worry about that. God's going to destroy the world, not man. So I quit worrying about it. What's the point? It's not going to happen that way. And the other thing that you think what happened with Rome, when the church, in its infancy, before Rome realized the difference between Judaism and Christianity, they protected the church. And Paul and others, on their missionary journeys, they had certain rights as being Roman citizens. So they would use that also in spreading the gospel. So all of these kingdoms, as the saying goes, brought something to the table to make this the exact perfect time for the Father to bring the Son into the world and the kingdom to be established. The perfect time. One more I'd like to mention, and briefly talk about the law of Moses and its contribution to this fullness of times. I remember someone in a class one time asked, why didn't, after Israel was taken out of Egyptian bondage, and there they are at Mount Sinai, instead of the 10 Commandments, why didn't the Messiah come into that time period right then, right there? And the brother mentioned they weren't ready for him. And they weren't. They needed a tutor, and that was God. Galatians 3, verse 24, the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. It was a tutor to bring the Jews closer to God. You think about those 10 Commandments that first were given. It taught them about him so that they could understand him more, and to especially understand sin and how much Jehovah abhorred sin. They needed to be taught these things. So they learned what sin was. But it also was taught, and they realized, that sin could not completely forgive them of their sins. Only in prospect of Christ dying on that cross in the future. We've talked about that Day of Atonement. Sacrifices were made for Israel, and we sometimes refer to it, all it did was roll back those sins. In a sense, that is true. But all the sacrifices they made, blood of the bulls and goats, could not take away sins, Hebrews 10:4, excuse me. But Israel learned the importance of the shedding of blood, that life was in that blood. So of the thousands to tens of thousands of sacrifices, blood being spilled throughout the year, they learned the importance of it, because without shedding of blood is no remission, Hebrews 9:22. And the law prepared them for that ultimate sacrifice. That was Christ, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins, Colossians 1:14. But it was also to keep them distinct, separate from the rest of the world, from the heathen nations. That's when they went into Canaan to conquer it, they were supposed to conquer all of the people there, not just leave some. And in Exodus chapter 23, 32 and 33, we read, thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods, speaking about the heathens. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. And it was a snare to Judea, to the Jews. When you read Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, and then you read verse 2 of that same chapter, until the time appointed is the same as the fullness of time. It's the same thing. Jesus lived and died under the law of Moses. Some believe that Jesus was a Christian. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew. He took the flesh of man, lived it perfectly, the only one who perfectly followed the law of Moses. As we are tempted, he was as well, yet without sin. He lived and died under that law, but he came to destroy the power of sin and death that Satan held over mankind. That's what he came to do. And he did this through his death and his resurrection. God sent his Son. Think about that. What does that mean? It means he always existed. He wasn't created as a Jehovah's Witness state. It talks about his always being existing. Long before Mary, he was at the very beginning with the Father, or God in the first person. And the Holy Spirit, or God in the third person, and Jesus, God in the second person, as we sometimes refer to that. But he was to redeem them, those that were under the law. That's why he came into this world. And then you have these Galatians. And most of them probably were not Jew, but Gentile, who were turning their backs upon the law of Christ that would save them from their sins and go back to the old law and the burdens that were under it and would not save them from their sins. They were going back to that bondage of sin and death. In Galatians 5:7 we read, "Ye did run well. Who did hinder you that ye should not obey the truth?" Well, so many people do the same today, almost as if they want to live under the bondage of sin and death. But the fullness of the time had came. This was the exact right time for the Father to send Christ to come into the world, the Son to save mankind. And all of these four kingdoms played a part in doing this. The law of Moses as well. It showed the Jews, if they had the heart to believe it, that Jesus was the Christ. He was the Son of God. He was the Messiah. All those prophecies in the Old Testament were proven to be true in the New. Every single one. But you think about the glory, you think about the majesty of God and how he was through all of these thousands of years bring this to be. Bring it to fruition. Just amazing. The power, the majesty, and the love of God. And yet, there are still people that we all know, and most of the world live this way. They want to remain under the bondage of sin. And trying to convince them of that is at times very difficult, and most times we're just laughed at, and they'll just walk away. If you are here this morning, I always wondered why people do that, because you are here this morning. Kind of redundant. But if you are here this morning, and if you're still under that law of sin and death, you don't have to remain that way. Jesus made it possible that you can be forgiven of that sin and be added to his church, the kingdom, through believing that he is the Son of God, of repenting of your sins of your past life, to have the blessing of confessing his name before others, and we've all done that, and remember how that felt, a wonderful feeling, and to be baptized for remission of sins, those sins will be removed forever. Doesn't matter how many you committed, they're all gone. They're washed away. And we can stand justified before our God as if we never sinned. And for those of us who are Christians, if we've fallen away, if we have brought shame or reproach upon the Lord's body, we don't have to be baptized all over again. We can ask God's forgiveness. And the congregation will pray for you, and we know that our God is faithful and true, and we will be forgiven of that sin. You don't have to remain in the bondage of sin and death either. If that's your need, we pray that you will come forward. Let's all stand and sing.